When Frank Darabont's feature film adaptation of Stephen King's serial thriller The Green Mile hit cinemas in 1999, it was kind of a big deal. King's 6-part novel had debuted in 1996, and the excitement that had surrounded the innovative marketing of the old-school Victorian-era format was still fresh in people's memories. It had been Darabont who'd adapted Shawshank, so expectations were rightly quite high. The Green Mile exceeded them. The script was moving and faithful to the novel. The performances were extraordinary. The actors perfectly cast. The production design and the soundtrack were evocative and meaningful. It's not flawless, but as a supremely faithful movie adaptation of a serialized 600-page novel, it succeeds far, far more often than it fails. I'm Gareth from WhatCulture.com, and here are 20 things you didn't know about The Green Mile. Number 20, the serialization. The novel was originally published as 6 short books, once a month between March and August 1996. For King, the serialized format was a creative challenge, and an impish thumb to the nose of readers who insisted on skipping to the end to see what happens. His mother had been one such reader. He remembered being 12 and horrified catching her holding her place on page 50 of an Agatha Christie mystery, while she flipped to the climax to find out who done it. That wouldn't be possible here. In fact, King was still writing as the first volumes were published, and had only the vaguest idea how it ended himself. King made sure to make each of the 6 installments a story on its own. Frank Darabont's adaptation as a single sprawling narrative merges the serialized format entirely. Today, it would probably have been presented to HBO as a serial, but the television landscape of today is significantly different to the television landscape of 20 years ago. Number 19, the 2 veterans signed up because the script was so moving. Darabont wanted James Cromwell for the part of Warden Moores from the very beginning. And after he read the script, Cromwell was moved to the point of tears and agreed instantly. Even 20 years ago, David Morse was one of the most respected character actors in the world. He hadn't heard about the script until he was offered the role of EDGECOMB's right-hand man, Brutus Brutal Howell, and admitted that he was in tears by the end of it. Number 18, Bruce Willis got Michael Clarke Duncan the gig. Darabont had been struggling to find an actor who could inhabit the pivotal role of John Coffey, the gentle giant wrongly accused. Ving Rhames and Shaquille O'Neal had been considered, but Rhames was a suave and savvy presence in front of the camera, while O'Neal wasn't an actor and couldn't be relied upon to hit the emotional beats required. It was Bruce Willis who stepped in and saved the day, as he tended to do back in those days. He heard about the open casting call and suggested the late Michael Clarke Duncan, who he'd just worked with on Armageddon. Coincidentally, maybe my favourite action film, don't at me. Duncan blew everyone away. The movie works on many levels, but it doesn't work at all without him. Number 17, Duncan used to be a bouncer and bodyguard. Raised in Chicago by a single mother, Duncan was 42 when his big break came. He dropped out of college to support her when she became ill, digging ditches and working the door at clubs to make ends meet. He'd always wanted to be an actor, and by his mid-20s was living in Los Angeles, hustling for roles while he worked as a bodyguard to the stars. It was former client the Notorious B.I.G.'s murder that led him to quit that job and pursue acting full-time. Number 16, he was also a treasure. After his tragic early passing, Tom Hanks gave his former co-star a moving tribute, calling him the treasure we all discovered on the set of The Green Mile, loved by cast and crew alike. That powerful, sensitive performance didn't actually come from any formal training. They'd hired an acting coach for him, a man named Larry Moss, who told him that Big Mike, as all Duncan's friends called him, wouldn't be able to play the part. He needed to find Little Mike first. Duncan was forced to recognize that the muscularity and intimidating presence that had served him so well in smaller roles wasn't what he needed to rely on to play John Coffey. Number 15, he wasn't as tall as he looked. While Duncan was a great wall of a man, he wasn't 7 foot tall, only 6'5", which is still pretty damn tall. However, both David Morse and James Cromwell were of a similar height. To give the impression that Duncan's John Coffey was even larger than real life, Darabont used subtle tricks of perspective and creative camera angles to make him tower over everyone even more than he already did. To keep up the illusion, Coffey's bed and the electric chair they used for him at the climax were both built to a smaller scale, making it look as though he could barely squeeze his gargantuan frame into the furniture. Number 14, casting Paul Edgecomb. Both Michael Keaton and Michael Douglas were considered for the role of Paul Edgecomb, head of the prison guards, while John Travolta was actually offered the role but turned it down. Eventually, Tom Hanks took the part as a personal favor to Frank Darabont. He'd been offered the role of Andy Dufresne in The Shawshank Redemption 5 years earlier, but had declined at the time because he was more interested in the title role in Forrest Gump. I mean, how do you even choose between those two? Happily, when Frank Darabont had lunch with Stephen King and mentioned the fact of Hanks' casting, the author was over the moon. Hanks had been the guy he'd had in mind for EDGECOMB all along. Number 13, the older Paul EDGECOMB. Originally, Hanks was set to play the older version of his character as well, but makeup tests just didn't seem convincing enough. Veteran character actor Dabbs Green was hired to play the older EDGECOMB because Darabont had been a huge fan of Invasion of the Body Snatchers and It, The Terror from Beyond Space, both of which had benefited from Greer's work. It unfortunately turned out to be Greer's swan song in movies. At first, his poor health wouldn't even allow him to accept the part, but Darabont had his heart set on the casting and shot scenes around the character until Greer was well enough to come in. Number 12, Period Inauthenticity Part 1. Pop Culture. When Hollywood makes period-set movies, the idea is usually to create the illusion of the time and place, not necessarily to be perfectly accurate. The Green Mile was originally set in 1932, but was pushed forward to 1935 to allow the important insertion of footage from the film Top Hat, which had come out that year. However, music doesn't have quite the same fixation in time as cinema. Popular 40s and 50s singer Eddie Howard is featured on songs on the film's soundtrack that were recorded in 1940. Similarly, the Billie Holiday record of I Can't Give You Anything But Love they use in the movie wouldn't be recorded until 1936. Gotta love yourself some time-traveling musicians, right? Number 11, Of Mice and Men. 15 real mice were actually used in The Green Mile, each trained for months to do specific tricks. However, most of the time the actors were actually reacting to a laser pointer moving around the floor, and not to a real rodent. For the stomping scene where Mr. Jingles sadly loses his life, a puppet was used that was far more expensive than any of the genuine mice had actually been. The exception to that rule came with the moment when the mouse defecates on EDGECOMB. That didn't really require any acting on Tom Hanks' part, as the mouse really did crap on him. Number 10, the mice weren't the only thing that squeaked. Doug Hutchison played the sadistic broken guard Percy with his usual flair for surly, wet-lipped malice. But according to Frank Darabont, he had help in clearly defining the monstrous nature of his character. That help came from the squeakiest pair of shoes that the props department had ever witnessed. Darabont was so enthralled by how loud and obnoxious the squeak was that he kept it in the film. Apparently, it felt like fate that one of his two villains made people suffer in this manner. Number 9, Period Inauthenticity Part 2. Prison Anachronisms. The movie, like the book, insists on the prison guards wearing a uniform when at work. In reality, prison guards didn't wear uniforms in 1935. Hanks, the cast, and the rest of the crew were all aware of the anachronism, but chose to ignore it as despite the lack of authenticity, the uniforms gave the scenes an authentic feel and were useful for the actors. The biggest prison anachronism in the film, of course, comes from Old Sparky himself. Prisons in Louisiana in the 30s used hanging as their method of execution, and didn't swap to the electric chair until 1940. Number 8, Hanks on set. Tom Hanks is uniformly agreed by all who've ever met him to be the living embodiment of pleasant awesomeness. And tales from the Green Mile set do nothing to contradict his reputation. Every Friday night, dinner was on Hanks. He'd order in a specific type of cuisine for the entire cast and crew, from sushi one week to In-N-Out burgers the next. Kinda jealous, I wish he worked in this office now. Number 7, the cast got on really well. Hanks is Hanks, but everyone else in the cast got on astonishingly well too, considering the length of the shoot. Hutchison told the story of Michael Clark Duncan finding out that he'd been one of the cons on Con Air a couple of years previously. If the Green Mile set was a bed of roses, the Con Air set was a bramble patch, and Hutchison had a horrible time on the film. During week 8 of the Green Mile shoot, Duncan finally found Hutchison in that film and thought it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. Thus, he decided to present Hutchison with a giant cardboard Con Air collage with the caption, "I'm ready for my close-up, Mr. DeMille," printed in bold letters at the top. The collage was made up of several still frames pulled from the film, and they were all of Hutchison avoiding the camera in one way or another. If you can't laugh with your pals, eh? Number 6, Period Inauthenticity Part 3, Product Placement. This is where we get to the really anal retentive part of the Period Inauthenticity section of this video, so feel free to roll your eyes, but it has to be done. That edition of Weird Tales that Delacroix is reading in 1935 was published in November 1937. The quartz clock used in the room with Old Sparky might have been invented in 1927, but it wasn't actually used in the world until the 1940s. And that was in laboratories. These particular bottles of Royal Crown Cola, the guards drink, were made in the 1950s. Before 1936, when painted bottles began to be used, the bottles would have been unadorned. Number 5, 2 of the characters are named after Harry Dean Stanton. 2 of EDGECOMB's fellow guards, played by Jeffrey DeMunn and Barry Pepper, are named Harry and Dean Stanton. However, the movie also features a horrible old man by the name of Toot Toot, played by veteran character actor Harry Dean Stanton. Every other mention of this tidbit of trivia claims that this was purely a coincidence, citing the fact that these are the names of the same characters in King's 1996 novel. This, of course, handily ignores the fact that Stephen, Mr. Americana King, would have been well aware of Stanton's incredible body of work when writing the novel. In point of fact, Stanton had played the detective in the 1983 adaptation of King's novel Christine. That means the guards are still almost certainly named after the actor. Number 4, always the bridesmaid, never the bride. Legendary composer Thomas Newman crafted a truly haunting score for the movie, the second he'd worked on with Darabont after The Shawshank Redemption. Incredibly, Newman has been nominated for a musical Oscar 15 times without a win in the last 25 years. In 1995, he was nominated twice for Best Original Score for Little Women and The Shawshank Redemption, and in 2009 he was nominated twice for Wall-E for Best Original Score and Best Original Song. The Green Mile was the longest soundtrack Newman had worked on at that point, and he spent 6 months on the project. Darabont described Newman's score as a rainbow of music and emotion, and to be honest, he's not wrong. Number 3, The Green Mile versus The Green Mile. Hollywood has a long and appalling history of playing fast and loose with their adaptations of literary properties, leading to oddly euphemistic credits such as based on, inspired by, or based on a 2-line summary of the novel written on the napkin of the hotel in which I pitched it to a board executive while absolutely off my face. One of those may or may not be made up. Astonishingly, here there are very few important differences between the source material and the adaptation. The time frame of the main story is jigged a little forward to 1935. We never get a description of the crimes that lead to Delacroix and Bitterbuck's imprisonment. EDGECOMB is telling the story in the present day, not writing it, and found out that Wild Bill was the real murderer through a vision he experienced through coffee, not through detective work. Aside from that, King's 600-odd page novel is carried to the screen almost completely, an impressive feat of screenwriting at the best of times. Number 2, some critics believe the premise is racist. Legendary director Spike Lee, amongst others, had criticized the film for employing the tired trope of the magical Negro with the John Coffey character. The idea invariably comes from white writers, and features a black character whose only function in the narrative is to help the white protagonists, usually both practically and spiritually. Their lives are bettered by his presence as, displaying otherworldly wisdom, he uses some form of mystical power to perform miracles, usually sacrificing himself in doing so. King's defense has always been that Coffey's railroading all the way to the Green Mile was only due to the color of his skin. He made him black because of the extent of racism in the South back in the 1930s. Number 1, The Green Mile was very personal for Frank Darabont. As Darabont was about to begin work on the screenplay, his cat was diagnosed with a tumor. On borrowed time, the animal wasn't in any pain, so Darabont cared for it at his desk while writing, describing it as his co-writer or even his co-pilot. The screenplay was complete in only 8 weeks, a remarkable accomplishment considering its quality, and especially the length of the novel it was so faithful to. Darabont's co-pilot passed away peacefully shortly afterwards. The celebrated writer-director has called The Green Mile the most satisfying movie of his career, and audiences tend to agree. Close to 50 of King's works have been adapted for the screen since Carrie in 1976, but The Green Mile was the only one to pass the $100 million milestone at the domestic box office, until it in 2017. The Academy also agreed. He was nominated for the 2000 Oscar for Best Screenplay based on material previously produced/published. Not only that, but it was nominated for the Best Picture Award at the 2000 Oscars. But we must reserve some thanks to our dearest co-pilot. May you forever rest in peace, little one. And that's our list. Did we miss any other amazing pieces of Green Mile trivia? Let us know if you've got any more in the comment section below, and do not forget to like, share, and click on that subscribe button. I've been Gareth from WhatCulture.com, and I'm sure that I will see you very, very soon.